Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. If I have not had the pleasure or opportunity to work with you in the past, let me introduce myself. My name is Lynn O'Hara, and I'm the Deputy Director for Educational Programs here at National History Day. We are so excited to be joining you for the second webinar in our series. We're focusing on teaching African American history. Dr. Krista Grensevich, who's usually here with you, is a little under the weather, so I get to be your substitute teacher today. But I am here with an excellent collection of experts and my colleague Jamie Hollyfield, who's going to be in charge of the question and answer and really getting things going today. So before we get started and jump in, what I'd like to do first off is say a huge thank you to our two sponsors, the 400 Years of African American History Commission and the Bezos Family Foundation, for making this possible. All right, a few bits of housekeeping. You have access to the Q&A box. Please feel free to pop questions in at any time. We want to make sure that you have the opportunity to have your questions answered. Also, for those of you who input questions early using the Google form, we have some excellent ones in the queue. We'll throw those in and mix those in, but please know that we've got them. We do use live captioning. If it helps you, great. If it gets in your way, go ahead and hit that live CC button. It'll turn it, you can toggle it on or off. I personally find it helpful. I will notice though that AI does say it, so sometimes proper names come out with some interesting spellings. Just know that it's not us. We're good to go. Just like last time, the survey that you do at the end is how we get your attendance credit. So please do put that survey in. Not only lets us know you're here, but it gives us some very important feedback. We share with the team the next morning. We call that early feedback. And then after everyone's had a chance to watch the video, we take that survey and run that report and use that to make adjustments moving forward, either for the next webinar or moving into the next year. Just like last time, we'll make sure that the slides and the recording will be posted tomorrow in Google Classroom. We'll put them under a tab called Webinar 2 Materials because, well, let's be honest, we don't get too creative with the names. We want to keep them straightforward. And the new module will release this Friday, February 7th. One reminder, Krista asked me to pass along for you. If you have any suggestions of things to add to the resources list, that's getting really interesting and some really good stuff on there. Please shoot it to her in an email. She's continually updating that as we go. All right, that's enough for me and the announcements and things that, we just have to do. But what I'd like to do tonight is let you know we have two excellent experts on with us tonight. We are going to start with our pedagogy expert, Mr. Jason Butler, and then when he's done, we're going to turn things over to Dr. Susan O'Donovan. Jason works with a group called Facing History and Ourselves, and Susan O'Donovan is a professor at the University of Memphis and is also a National History Day Regional Coordinator in Tennessee. You can decide which is the more impressive of the two. But we are thrilled to have both of you joining us. We're going to focus in the beginning and turn things over to Jason to talk a little bit about the piece that he worked on for this particular resource and ways that we can help make decisions to help our students learn history. So, Jason, we're going to turn things over to you. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really happy to share this time and space with you. To jump right in, I would say that teaching African American history in appropriate and effective ways is a moral imperative. I want to name that off the top, and hopefully you'll come to understand why I say that over the course of our time together. So we wanted to kind of go over a few things to orient us to what this obligation entails. The first thing is that we should teach history, not myths and fairy tales. So a fairy tale would be the founding fathers were noble geniuses who descended from Mount Olympus. They did amazing things politically that changed the country and changed the world. That is true. It is also true that many of them owned, bought, and sold human beings. That's the history part. Secondly, of course, we want our students to be less confused about the world rather than more confused. So we have to let them know, how is it that this world arrived in the state that it is? And thirdly, I would urge you to respect students' capabilities. They know the world is not fair. They know people are not always benevolent. So better that we help them grapple with those things under our care and guidance than we let some misguided soul on TikTok help them sort through these things. It's an opportunity that we have and we should take very seriously. Now, this stuff can be challenging. Teaching violent, sensitive, graphic topics in African American history can be very tricky. We don't want to upset students. We don't want to upset parents. We don't want to upset administrators. Definitely want to acknowledge and respect those things. But oftentimes that leads us into certain mistakes that we really want to avoid. So we'll run through them and hopefully give you a better idea of how to avoid them as we go through. So the first thing is what I call skirting. An example of this would be explaining the Great Migration as a period when Black people left the South to seek better job opportunities. That's true. It's also true that they left the South to avoid the daily dehumanization and violence that they encountered. So those are very different pictures that we'd be painting for our students. Secondly, to be superficial, to superficialize. If we have our students understand that segregation meant Black families were kept out of white schools, restaurants, and swimming pools, again, that's true, but we need to have them understand how it is that segregation was enforced and implemented. And the answer to that, of course, would be violence, threats, and intimidation from people around town, people down the street, people across town, police, terrorist organizations such as the KKK, White Citizens Council, and Knights of the White Camellia. That is avoiding the superficialization trap. Third, sugarcoating. We want to teach about enslaved people's cultural practices, for example. It is really important to humanize them and to lift up the contributions that they made. However, if we did this without having students understand what enslaved people had to endure when they weren't laying the foundation for Southern food as we know it, let's just say, we're doing a disservice to our students and to the topic and to the people we're studying. Last is simplifying. We want to avoid the misstep of simplifying. Um, if we go with the standard Northerners opposed slavery and Southerners supported it, that is a generalization. It is a simplification that obscures a lot of really important realities, such as not all Northerners opposed slavery, and many benefited from it. The Northern economy we know was largely based on the byproducts of enslaved labor. So we've got to keep in mind the importance of avoiding missteps such as these. Also important is to understand who is sitting in front of us. Now, you know this better than I do. Adolescents are a challenging and unique group of students to be dealing with. We know that students may react to these topics in surprising ways. They might be silent when we expect them to speak. They might be speaking when we expect them to be silent. They might laugh when we expect them to be serious. They might have emotions that come out in unexpected ways. All this is something we need to anticipate so that we're not caught off guard and put in a high stress, reactive moment that really doesn't enable us to be our best. Secondly, these topics are difficult for anyone to grasp. The complexity, the depth, the magnitude of humans' cruelty and human suffering is a lot to take in. So we want to acknowledge that. We want to treat it with the seriousness that it deserves. And then finally, when we're talking about adolescents, the young people in our care, we want to keep in mind that topics pertaining to violence, oppression, and hardship may touch a nerve with students with what we call proximal experiences. This means that in their own life or family or background or culture, they have experience with these things. Now, of course, we can't know all that students have and bring to the table, which is why we need to be careful with all of them. So that's the secret is treat all students with that same level of care. So, how to navigate this challenging landscape where we know we have to be very careful and sensitive with adolescents because they are young people with particular needs and particular capabilities. There's some best practices we want to make sure to keep in mind. The first one is to prep students for this content. In the same ways that we're talking about it now, we need to talk about it with adolescents, with our students. So we need to acknowledge up front that this content is sensitive, it is emotional, it is upsetting, and it is important. We need to prep students for this before we just dive in. Afterward, we want to think about giving students an outlet. So this might be giving them a chance to journal. Journaling is a really wonderful release, a way for students to clarify and process their thoughts. You might not even collect these. This might be journaling for the student's eyes only. On the flip side, you can do something that you do collect, such as exit cards. You can also allow students to express themselves via art, which can be a really beautiful, healthy way for students to process challenging topics such as these. And then finally, I would point to silent reflection. Giving students a minute or two just to think and process is really important. We've all been in that situation where, we're trying to cram a bunch of things in, then the bell rings, students are rushing out the door. You don't want to be in that position. You don't want to put students in that position when they're heading off to, bump into their friends at the locker and go screaming down the hall. If they've just freshly emerged from a topic such as this, you want to give them processing time to kind of safely exit this space, which can be so sensitive and delicate. The last thing I would mention is to monitor emotions. So far, I've spoken about monitoring students' emotions, but you also want to make sure to monitor your own. We all are human beings with sensitivities, with emotions, with baggage that we carry, with topics that are uncomfortable for us, with things that we try to stifle down within us that bubble up at unexpected times. So the more we're in touch with our own emotions, the better we can serve students, the more we can be the kind of people students need to be. I'm sorry, the better we can be the kind of people students need us to be. So to summarize, I would say, as with anything in the classroom, we know it starts with planning. And this is what I would refer to as a careful, principled approach to planning. You want to start with your learning objectives. Content, sure, but also skills. These skills can be a wide range. In particular, I would refer to thinking skills. Somewhere in your state standards or learning objectives, every state has a different vernacular. Students need to learn how to evaluate and assess and determine cause and effect and understand complexity. Well, these are goals that can be reached by teaching these topics in this way. Also, you want to examine the benefits and drawbacks of using various topics or sources. You want to think about what would my students gain by grappling with something, a particular source or a particular topic in a certain way, and what would they miss if they're not exposed to it. For an example here, I'd go back to the superficializing example that I gave earlier. I mentioned how segregation meant that Black kids were kept out of pools and schools. Students could draw a reasonable conclusion and say, well, that's not too bad. I mean, they could go to other ones, right? Just because Black kids were kept out of some schools, they could go to other schools. That's not too bad, right? So students can reach that conclusion if we don't do the topic justice, if we don't explain that it wasn't just a simple exclusion, there was a whole lot more that went into it. So that's where we want to make sure to give them content engagement and sources that help them understand something with the real depth that they need. So my rule of thumb basically is to use content and sources that are the least graphic or violent possible that still allow students to learn what they need to learn. And when I say learn what they need to learn, I don't mean just to pass the test, which is important, yes. but really for the bigger picture. And here's where the moral imperative comes in. Students need to understand these topics as a part of our history, and it's our moral obligation to help them do that, I believe. Um, we want to honor them, to understand that they can think critically, they can make moral judgments, they can draw their own conclusions. And if we allow them to develop in these ways, then they will be willing and able to do it as adults. And I think we can agree, we want a society full of people who can think critically, draw conclusions, and make moral judgments, understand complexity. This is the kind of young person we want to be sending out into the world. So honor your students by giving them a chance to do that. So hopefully these guidelines will help you a bit as you think about taking on the very serious and important challenge of teaching sensitive and graphic or violent topics in African American history. With that, I will turn things over to Dr. O'Donovan to talk about the nuts and bolts of how to teach some of these sources and topics.
You have to okay, there we go.
While we're transitioning, I'll give Dr. Donovan a minute to get that up. Thank you so much, Jason. I think these are good questions that I think we're always asking. These are some really good questions about practice that I think we can always keep at the back of our head as we're going through. Not just, I think, teaching history in general, and also remembering that these are adolescents and they have special needs. So thank you for that. All right, Dr. O'Donovan, it's over to you.
And I agree, and I thank you, Jason. That was really good. That was very useful, especially for me, because I teach undergraduates. There's not a lot of difference between undergraduates and high school students, but there is a pretty big gulf between undergraduates and middle school students. So the material I'm going to be showing you tonight, certainly it's up to the teachers whether or not you want to use it. But I hope some of the strategies that I'm going to share for working with these materials and the way I cut into the history of enslaved people in my own classroom, you can use some of these strategies and some of these methods in your own classroom. So like I do with all my classes, every class, actually I had a class today counting up how many problems I pose in the course of a week, and it came out to be quite a few. I start every lesson and every week is a problem-based week. And so the problem that we're going to be thinking about here, using a couple of primary sources that come out of my own teaching materials, is power. I mean, and power, every student and every American comes in thinking they have this. It's usually a very simplified understanding of power. So what we're going to do, following well on some of Jason's suggestions, is think about the complexity of power and think about that by studying the history of enslaved through a pair of primary sources. And so it gets students thinking about the history of slavery, but in a organized way that's framed securely within this question of power. And I found that has worked with great success in my own classroom, and hopefully it would work in your classroom. But there's so many other questions you could think of. You could frame it around questions of gender, thinking about different gendered experiences. You could frame your questions around family. So the field is wide open in terms of questions, and then it's just a matter of selecting some primary sources that give the students the materials they need to be able to think through these things. So we can study enslaved people's past. Oh gosh, now I've got to figure out how not to. I got to move you. All of our little things. Okay, so we can, again, we can study enslaved people's past from many perspectives with many different ideas or themes in mind. And so today it's going to be about power. So the questions we want to ask is, who had power? How did they come by power? How did they use that power? How did that power change over time? And for what purpose did they use that power? So it's easy to think in terms of slaveholders' power. They had a lot. There's no doubt about it. No scholar of slavery is ever going to argue that. They're never going to argue that there was any redeeming qualities to human bondage. They're never going to argue that slaveholders, were benign, which was an old Jim Crow argument. Okay, they could force people to work. They could break apart families through sale, through hire, through just being sheer mean. They could beat and whip. They could abuse and misuse. And on occasion, they killed their enslaved workers. So, but if you stop and think about it, they weren't going to do that often because they needed enslaved people as workers. And that, as we'll discover today, put important levers of power into enslaved people's hands. Now, I want to caution you, it was never enough power until the Civil War broke out. It was never enough power to undo slavery. But little bits of power can be used to protect yourself, to kind of you use it to leverage to slightly improve your living situation, your work situation. So even though it's not a lot of power, it was really important to the lived experience of enslaved people. So it's really worth thinking about it. What were they able to do within this oppressive system, and how did they come by the tools to do this? So first document I want to give you is, I hope everybody can see it. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger here. My daughter yells at me when I don't make my documents big enough. So this is a letter from a Georgia overseer to a Georgia planter, and it's dated in July of 1855. So since this is all History Day, we want to start with our basic analysis. And y'all should know the drill, but let's do it because we're going to have to do it with our classes, with our students. Okay, are you going to click through? Oh, my clicker doesn't work. Okay. Shoot, what happened? Lynn, I lost all my animation again.
That's right. It might be because you zoomed in. Try using the arrow
Okay.
button, and if not, we might need you to zoom out.
Ah, there it goes. Okay. Well, thank you. I didn't know that. Okay. So you know the drill. When was the source produced? Where was it produced? Okay. It was when? July of 1855. Where? Near Americus, Georgia. I think there's a teacher from Southwest Georgia in here this evening. So yay, he'll know exactly where this is. Who produced it? An overseer named Stancil Barwick. Can you see my cursor over here? Okay, great. So I got an arrow. Okay, why did they produce it? Well, that will come when we read it. I'll read it for you all, just to speed things along. And then the other question we always want to ask or remind students about is what was going on in history around this time that might be relevant to our understanding. This is a long way of saying context. What else was going on there that helps us interpret this document and to make sense of this document? So let's go through here real quick. So he writes in July of 1855, and he writes, "Dear Sir, I received your letter yesterday evening, was very sorry to hear that you had heard that I was treating your Negroes so cruelly." So he's actually writing his boss. This is an absentee planter who lives over near Macon, and Barwick has to write him this letter. "Now, sir, I do say to you in truth that the report is false. There is no truth in it. No man or set of men has ever seen me mistreat one of the Negroes on the place. Now, as regards the women losing children, Treaty lost one, it is true. I never heard of her being in that way until she lost it. She was at the house all the time. I never made her do any work at all." You can have a really good discussion here about taking sources seriously and taking them literally. And, we don't really want to take this guy literally because we know he's an overseer writing to his boss. So he's going to be, putting the best spin possible on events. She said to me last month that she did not know she was in that way herself until she lost the child. As regards Louisine, she was in the field, it is true, but she was worked as she pleased. I never said a word to her in any way at all until she come to me in the field and said she was sick. I told her to go home. She started, and on the way she miscarried. She was about 5 months gone. This is the true statement of case. Now, sir, upon my word and honor, I have tried to carry out your wishes as nearly as I possibly could do. Ever since I've been on the place, I have not been to 3 neighbors' houses since I have been here. I come here to attend my business. I have done it faithfully. The reports that have been sent must have been carried from this place by Negroes. The fact is that I made the Negro men work and made them go straight. That is what is the matter and is the reason why my place is the talk of the settlement. I have found among the Negro men 2 or 3 hard cases, and I have had to deal right rough, but not cruelly at all. Among them, Abram has been as trifling as any man on the place. Now, sir, what I wrote you is truth, and it can't be disputed by no man on earth. NB, which is a 19th century version of a postscript. As regards my crop of corn, I think I will make a plenty to do the place next year. My cotton is injured by the wet weather and lice. The weed is large enough, but nothing on it. I will be done working at a week or 10 days from this time. So back to why did he produce it? Clearly, he's answering some letter that he received from his boss, that he received from John B. Lamar. And we can tell from what he is talking about that something went on, that some of the enslaved women had lost babies, and he was trying to kind of explain how he had no role in this. And then he does this really interesting turn in the last end that blames the enslaved men, and particularly he puts the finger on enslaved men that he had to quote unquote treat, how did he put it? Deal with right rough for spreading news. And this raises a lot of questions about power. So let's dig in and ask some of those questions. So who has the power here? And how do we know? Well, clearly, Stansell Barwick has power. The planter, John B. Lamar, has power. But who are the people that even Barwick thinks got him in trouble? Who ratted him out? And so who ratted him out are these enslaved men, and maybe more, maybe not even those. But if Barwick isn't passing word, and he would hardly be the one passing the word around the community about, these women losing their babies. In fact, he has absolutely there's absolutely no benefit for him to make that point public, and for sure to let on to the slaveholder. And this gets back to context, what was going on in history around this time that might be relevant to our understanding. Well, one big thing for sure, back in 1808, the transatlantic slave trade was ended to the United States, and the movement of enslaved people in and out of southern ports has been carefully monitored by port officials since then. What this means is, unlike in the colonial period when slaveholders could just buy new slaves off the international market when they needed them, now they have to depend on natural reproduction. And it's really changed the power dynamics between master and slave by this period. Because women have women need to be healthy, and they need to be kept safe for the duration of their pregnancies. Children need to be raised. Otherwise, because they're who planters depend on for future labor forces. And this puts a considerable amount of power into enslaved people's hands. And it's something that enslaved people would be clearly aware of. They know that planters need them and need their children. It's made clear every day with every slave sale, with hire, with the way they're treated. And these men knew exactly which buttons to push to catch John B. Lamar's attention. They could have just complained about Stansell Barwick beating on him, but that wouldn't have been as effective as telling Lamar that Barwick was causing the women to lose their babies. So that also explains how they came by that power. That power had to do with that this power came about because of a change in federal law, because of this new antebellum dependency on natural reproduction to grow or reproduce a slave force. What form does this power take? This gets interesting. This also leads us to talk about what enslaved men do on a plantation. Well, they're off the plantation. The fact that they're off the plantation is not a surprise to Barwick. It wouldn't be a surprise to any planter. Cotton needs to be carried to market. Cotton doesn't have legs. It's not going to go on its own volition. Someone's got to drive the wagon. Someone's got to drive the wagon to go get supplies from town. Someone's got to drive the wagon to go pick up, the overseer's daughter for instance, I don't know if this is the case with Barwick, from her friend's house. Someone has to drive white people around. Someone has to deliver the mail. Enslaved people were put to all kinds of work like that carried them legitimately off the plantation, gave them the right to be in the roads because they traveled with a pass, which actually doesn't stop movement. It just controls and regulates movement. And so there's all kinds of opportunity for enslaved people to talk out in public. And so that power takes the form of mobility. It takes the form of simply having a mouth to talk with and to be in a situation where they could kind of drop these hints to make Barwick's plantation the talk of the community. Okay, and so to what purpose was this power put? This is where your students could really have an interesting conversation. Were the men primarily interested in protecting the women? That's certainly a strong possibility. Or were they also using the problem with the women and the loss of their babies to take Barwick down a notch or two? Barwick's not a nice guy, I had to deal right rough, but not cruelly at all. Well, that's a really, really curious statement. I mean, what's the measure of right rough? What's the measure of not cruelly at all? He's not on the receiving end of these punishments that he's dealing out. And so the enslaved men could also very well be they may have well been also or exclusively targeting Barwick for being, overly oppressive, overly violent. I mean, because you can read this letter, and my students read this letter, and what we have is a overseer that's really squirming. He's trying to, protect his job. He's doing a lot of, well, I'm so good. I never leave the place. I don't do anything bad. I attend to my work. It sounds like a guy who's trying to save his job. So the enslaved men they were able to put Barwick in a really tenuous spot. We don't think about enslaved people doing those things, but we've got, archives crammed full of materials that show these little power struggles that are complex. They have to be understood in context. And they raise a lot of interesting, whoops. I did not need to go that far. Well, let's see. Okay, so we could ask the students, so what have we learned about enslaved people's experiences by studying this document? Well, we learn about something about work routines and going off plantations. We learn about relationships and kind of these complicated relationships between overseer and planter and between overseer and enslaved people, and indirectly about relationships between the enslaved people and their owner, beyond, because these guys reach beyond their overseer to talk indirectly to the planter through the rumor mill. So there's a whole lot of things that we learn about enslaved people's day-to-day experiences by reading this document. Okay, so let's go on to another one here. And I expect you guys have lots of questions about this, because this is a really strange way to teach for me, because I'm usually, I'm very interactive with my students. You would be answering all these questions that I pose, but we can't do it with this format. Okay, so I've got another document that I also like to use in my classroom. And actually, this one's another really interesting one that allows us to think more deeply about power, to think about power in more complex ways. And this one focuses on power in the slave trade. So again, we want to start with that basic analysis. When was the source produced? February of 1821. Where was it produced? We really have no idea. We know he's a North Carolina slave trader, and his name is Obadiah Fields, but we really don't know where he was when he wrote it, okay? Who produced it? Well, that's easy. Obadiah Fields. Wonderful name. Why did he produce it? Okay, that's really a good question, but it reads like something. This is where you have to think about what he's saying and who might be interested in kind of the information. So we'll get to that. We'll circle back around after we do a close reading. what was going on in history around this time that might be relevant to our understanding. Pretty much, the same thing as we talked about in the previous slide, but add to it that this, in lieu of purchasing enslaved laborers off of the international trade, American planters had no choice but to purchase them off the domestic slave trade. And it was in kind of general terms, it was a north to south trade. And so it makes sense. We have a North Carolina slave trader, and he's picking up enslaved people around there, and he's selling them south. So, so that's kind of the context we need. All right, so now let's dig in and ask our power question. So you see how we're doing this? First, we do the basic analysis, the Sam Weinberg analysis, the who, what, where, when, and why. And then we come back with our questions about power, or questions about gender, or questions about religion, any of these questions that you want to pose to your students. So who has the power here, and how do we know? Well, let's read this document and be happy that I transcribed it, because this man's handwriting is absolutely abysmal, and it's still going to sound funny when I read it. So it's an excerpt from a letter of a North Carolina slave trader. We don't know to whom, but based on what we're reading, I'm going to guess probably to a business partner. And he wrote it on the 11th of February in 1828. And he writes, I left home with Martin's Negro sales and swaps. I have sold 25 slaves. And this is hard to think about human beings being bought and sold. But again, these are kind of the realities that Jason is right. We don't want to downplay. We don't want to simplify. We don't want to sugarcoat. 5 were swapped. Well, 5 swapped, so he did the swapping, and child for Isabel. So 5 of those that he started with, he swapped for Isabel and a child. Both Isabel and the child sold for $400 in cash, and note of hand for $50, which note I sold for $30. So Isabel went for a total of $430. Do like me and just skip over the math. I'm not really, these notes are promissory notes. And so, so there's all kinds of shady, loose financial exchange stuff going on in here. Dick and his wife swapped for Circe and Toby. Bob brought in $280 in cash and a note in hand for $70, which I sold for $50, which leaves the balance of $330. Kiersey sold for $262.50 and a horse at $50. Toby brought home the highest cash offered, which she doesn't tell us what it is. So this is kind of like typical stuff you would expect to see in a slave trader's ledger. And that's why I think he's, was really writing it as a report of what was going on in terms of his business dealings, which meant he was probably sharing this information with a business partner. I can't imagine anybody else would care. But this is where it gets really interesting, and it really gets us into this question of power. So it was understood that I should give the Negroes a present if they would try to get homes and not do anything against the interest of their sales. Now, I would pause here and I would ask the students, what's he getting at here? What does he mean? Try to get homes and not do anything against the interest of their sales. And if they're having trouble kind of getting their minds around that, ask them about if they've ever bought or sold something. Now, I've bought and sold horses, and I tell you what, they can be tricky. Because, horses are not sentient beings or thinking beings. They don't think in abstractions. So they're not going to deliberately mess up their sales. But if you have a horse that bucks off a prospective buyer, the odds are they're not going to buy it. If you're trying to sell your car and all of a sudden it leaks oil all over the driveway, yeah, I suspect the guy with the cash is going to turn around and jump in his car and drive away. What happens when you try to sell a human being? What kind of power does because, he's giving him a present. Well, yeah, I think we could probably read that more as a bribe. He's calling it a present, but he's giving them this present so they would try to get homes and not do anything against their sales. So we would ask students, what kind of things could a person do to affect their sale? So say they don't want to be sold to this person that looks particularly mean. And since labor is the driving force behind American slavery, it's all about the oppression of labor, the exploitation of labor. Whoever is buying them is looking for a good worker. So think of all the ways. I mean, and your high school students will really pop out, answers to this, but so will middle school students. What can you do to make yourself not look good as a worker? Well, you can sniffle, you can limp, you could hold your belly. You can, act like you've got broken bones or bad arthritis. There's a million and one ways that you can present yourself as unfit to work. And so that's what Obadiah is trying not to do here. And he's pretty certain about this. So, so who has power in a sale? Maybe not absolute power, but enough that Obadiah believes that they could mess up their sales. Maybe, decrease the price that they could be sold for if they convince a lot of people that they're really not healthy. So enslaved people have power, so much power that Obadiah gave Isaac $3, Dick $2, Tom $1, Isabel $2, and Dick and Isaac got a hat each on top of their cash bribe. So, stop and think about this. What's shifted here? Up here we have Obadiah, the slave trader. He's happily buying and selling. But now we see a whole different other side of that trade that brings enslaved people in as actors, as agents in this transaction. They're not that car in the driveway. They're not the soup cans in the grocery store. They're human beings who can read the room, read the people buying them, and make up their own decisions about how they were going to behave while they were standing on an auction block. And they came by that power because they're people, and they come by that power because of the way sales happen. So, and what form does this power take? Well, we've talked about some of these forms. You could pretend to be sick, you could pretend to be crippled, you could pretend to be old, you could pretend to be tired, you could be, pretend all kinds of things that, you could pretend to be really bad-tempered. Planters don't go out of their way to buy surly slaves because that's going to make it harder, they think, to actually exploit them. So don't act particularly biddable. So there's other ways. Okay. So to what purpose was this power put? Well, I think that's probably also pretty easy to get to. Your students shouldn't have any trouble getting to that. To exert some measure of control over their future. These are people who are legally owned. They do not own their bodies. They do not own their children. Their marriages are not protected by law. These little scraps of control that they can exert are gifts, not from their slaveholders, but the gifts they give themselves. So maybe Dick and Tom and Isabel were trying to remain with their own families or not be sold too far away from their old families, because again, we don't know where this guy is. We don't know anything about these men and women and their families. Maybe they're trying to just not, land in the hands of someone who's, reputed to be a really, really terrible, mean, exploitive, violent owner. So what they're trying to do is exert some measure of control over lives that they really have very little control over in general. So last, what do we learn, again, about enslaved people's history by studying this document? Well, we learn a lot about the internal workings of the slave trade. We learn about what enslaved people can do within that trade, that they are not utterly powerless. We learn, as one of my students put in undergraduate, he read this and he says, oh my gosh, those enslaved people were making slavery more expensive. When you think about the millions who were bought and sold over the course of antebellum slavery, that cost could add up fast. And it was a really smart, insightful comment. And students come up with this. They can read these things and they think, oh my gosh, look what's going on here. So again, they learn an awful lot about enslaved people's history. They learn about one of the most disruptive, violent components, elements of enslaved people's history, the domestic slave trade. And they do it by not tackling the trade directly, but asking these questions about power. And I really, and we learned this through History Day itself with these wonderful annual themes. They give you a way to get into topics that allow you to ask these questions that in turn open up a lot of knowledge, open up a lot of information and insight. So I would conclude this lesson with thoughts about power in slave society. So were enslaved people powerless? Let's put that back on the table. Let's see if it changed students' mind here to look at these documents. And it's okay if it didn't change their mind, or if it's, or if they did, because what I'd follow this question with was, hey, okay, I like what you're saying. Can you explain your reasoning? Sounds like a real good History Day exercise, doesn't it? And gets back to that critical thinking. What forms did their power take? Again, you can have the students explain their reasoning. What parts of the evidence led them to their answer that they're giving you? What were some of the sources of their power? And this is where you can actually begin to take a bigger picture and think about how power is contingent. That the power that was exercised by the enslaved men under Barwick's watch is different from the kind of power that's being exercised by the men and women who are being sold by Obadiah Fields, so that they understand that power is different in different locations, that power doesn't take the same form in every place at all times. Power is historical. Power needs to be contextualized. Okay, and this gets us to this one. Did everyone exercise the same kind of power? Why or why not? And you can dig deeper into this question about the sources of power. How did enslaved people use their power? Who's getting protected with this power? Are they doing it for selfish reasons, collective reasons? Are they doing it to protect their families, to protect themselves? Let's see what the evidence is. What's it telling us? How has this analysis changed our understanding of enslaved people's history? So you can step back and see how we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger here in these questions. I mean, we're talking about many days lessons by now. Does this analysis make us think differently about power in our own society? We can circle around. Let's make this really relevant to students. And actually, what I would hope that they come away from this is that no one is without power, including middle school students, high school students, people who don't have a vote, people who don't even own their own bodies. They all have access to some form of power that they can use to advance their own interests in no matter how small a way. So thank you. Do you want me to go on to another page, or is this okay, Lynn?
Okay, if you could just leave that there for a second.
Okay, and I will.
Dr.
Okay.
O'Donovan and Jason Butler for their work today. I think one of the things that comes out of this conversation is that the story is very complex. And I think this story is complicated by the fact that oftentimes big pieces of the historical record are left out, right? We don't necessarily have the direct reactions of the individuals who are mentioned in these letters. It's very hard to find this information because of power structures that were created to deny this information. So I think we're forced to look at sources and look in different ways to help tell these stories. And I think it's important that we see that in doing this study, that we're looking to tell as many stories from the perspectives of many different people as possible, and get to the idea of what world did enslaved people live in, and how can we draw out those threads in those stories. What I'm going to ask you to do, Dr. O'Donovan, is please stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and share mine as we transition into our Q&A phase. What we'd like to do as we get started is to take a moment and thank our sponsors, the 400 Years of African American History Commission and the Bezos Family Foundation. And we are going to transition into our Q&A. As a reminder, please take a moment to fill out the attendance form / feedback form so that we can get your thoughts and ideas. You can do that either by using the QR code or the link that's there. And if you're on your phone, don't stress about it. We'll go ahead and make this link available tomorrow if you can't do it right now. But what I'd like to do is turn things over to my colleague, Jamie. I know you have some good questions in the queue, and encourage anyone in the audience who has questions, whether it's about the teaching piece or some of the historical sources, to please put them in the Q&A box so that we can share or assimilate or gather as many as possible to answer right now. So thank you.
All right, so I'm going to start with, there are 4 questions that some of you submitted prior to tonight's webinar. So I'm going to start with those 4 questions, but if you have additional questions, you can throw it in the Q&A box. The first question that we received was, what suggestions do you have on how to best go about teaching slavery and the history of enslaved people as individuals and not just as a homogeneous group that was part of a labor system?
Can I answer
Dr.
that?
Adamo, why don't you start that one? I'm going to ask the same question.
I think
Ms.
you can't
Butler as
do
well.
any better than the antebellum slave narratives. These are the ones that were written by people like Henry Box Brown, Charles Ball, Frederick Douglass. You can assign excerpts of these. You can assign the whole thing if you think you're going to, the students will read it. Solomon Northrop's narrative, and all of them are available digitally and free. I can share the link to the archive that holds these, and then Lynn can get them out to you. I don't know, can I type into the question Q&A box, Lynn, or not?
No, but if you send them to me, we'll get them on the resource list so everyone
Okay,
can access
I will
it.
do that. Okay, yeah, because when you do it that way, you're getting. Now, there's a couple things, though, to keep in mind with most of these antebellum slave narratives, especially the ones that were published before the Civil War. If they're published after the Civil War, this doesn't really apply. But most of those that were published before the Civil War were sanitized, I think we could say, by Northern abolitionists, because these narratives were actually, most of them were intended for a white Northern audience. And so they were tailored by these kind of ghostwriters to better suit their audience's sensibilities. So this was an audience, and you can see it really clearly in Solomon Northrop's narrative. This was an audience that they weren't fully committed to sharing their lives with people of color. And the last thing they wanted to was a slave uprising. They did not want that. And so any mention of slaves organizing, of enslaved people rising up and rebelling, most of that was airbrushed out of these narratives. So when you read Solomon Northup, he actually, when you look at it, he gets freed because he has white friends in high places, to put it very bluntly. And the people who don't have white friends in high places, everybody else on these plantations where he lived in Louisiana for those 12 harrowing years, stayed enslaved. And so so there's a message here that you have to be really careful that the students understand the audience for which these narratives were being published, so that they can better interpret it. But aside from that, you still get a heck of a lot of information. So Northwood tells us all sorts of things about his day-to-day life, about the way that he moves about on his various masters and overseers' commands from place to place. His work is, on whatever the creek was, I can't remember what it was called, where he was floating lumber downstream. I mean, so you get a lot of very rich detail from a person who spent 12 years in slavery and can talk about it. And these were, topics that weren't going to bother this Northern audience, and so they stayed in his narrative. Same thing with Frederick Douglass's narrative. Same thing with many, many other narratives. So I would go, if I was going to be, wanting students to get right to these enslaved people and their and to hear their experiences from them, I would go straight to the slave narratives. And there's lots of other ones. I'll give Lynn a whole list, because there's also much shorter ones that have been compiled into very large books where, if you're working with middle schoolers and you don't want really long pieces for them to read, just 1 or 2 page interviews that were done among those who escaped to Canada in the 1840s and 1850s, interviews with those who were able to escape or at least talk to a Northerner in New England. And so there's a number of other sources, and I'd be really happy to provide you with some suggestions.
Okay. Jason, can I toss that question to you as well? What are some ways to help students see a variety of perspectives and not look at any group as one person?
I think the key phrase in your question, Lynn, was any group. There's a tremendous amount of othering that goes on when we think about slavery, so much so that we often refer to them as slaves as opposed to people who were enslaved, right?
Yeah.
And it's the ultimate form of othering because it stops us or hinders us from thinking of them as human beings just like us. So to help students understand this, I would ask them, are all 7th graders the same? We can label them 7th graders. Are they all the same? Well, no, of course not. Are all teachers the same? Are all bus drivers the same? Are all coaches the same? Well, of course not, even though they share a label. So, letting the students know these were individuals just like any other in terms of having personalities and dreams and values they passed on to their children and family they loved and people who loved them back. So
Yeah.
those sorts of things, just to center the humanity of all of these people, I think helps students train their minds a little bit to think of them as individuals in unusual circumstances, but also like any other human being.
Oh, I agree, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. I just approach, I talk about people. I mean, and you're kind of bound to talk about, put a label. Try as you might, you can't just write, men and women, because it's too easy to confuse white men and enslaved men. But always, never. I mean, I think we both subscribe to Barbara Jean Field's policy. Black is not a noun. Slave is not a noun. It's a legal status, and when we do that, we do lose the humanity. We forget that we're talking about human beings that have minds and ears and eyes and pasts and presents. And so I think, kind of picking up on that, some of these shorter pieces that I'm going to recommend to Lynn would be a really good exercise in drawing out all the complexity, the differences between, these 4 million people eventually by 1860. And how different they were, their different experiences, different kinds of families, lived in different places, did different things. So, but we can still do that with the narratives because there's lots of people that, that move through them. And so the students can kind of pick them apart. Can we talk about enslaved people as a unified group? I mean, that's another great question to ask of your students, and give them the materials then that will help them answer it.
Okay, what other questions do we have?
There's a teacher who just wants clarification on exactly what's being deduced from the document with the slave prices during the sale of human beings. They felt as though you, Susan, were stating that the slaves pretended to be sick to avoid being sold, but it feels as though that plays into the narrative of enslaved African Americans faking their illnesses or not really feeling pain. What exactly are you trying to say, or are you hoping for the students to take away from the last document that you displayed? A hat is not a gift to a slave. Freedom is the only gift a slave would truly cherish.
Well, I think we need to, for starters, as historians, we need to think about this from the perspective of the people we're studying. And yes, I mean, think about the tools that are at an enslaved person's hands. What can they do to protect themselves? And, freedom is a great gift, but when you explore even more documents, you realize that family is actually of a greater importance in holding family together. So, I'm not too sure about that. We value freedom, individual freedom. But, when you even look at the numbers of people who ran away, it was a very, very small number of people who ran away and at least ran away with the intent of leaving permanently. And they were usually single young men because family was critically important to enslaved people, partly, one, love, just, normal effective relations, but also these families were also subject to being broken apart at a moment's notice or no notice at all. So keeping families together often trumped freedom. And we see this when enslaved people in the latter part of the 1850s were told that if they were manumitted by their masters, they would have to leave Louisiana. Arkansas was another state that tried this, and Virginia. And they said, no, we're going to stay enslaved because we want to stay up with our families. So we do have, proof of those things, and we could see that also in the narratives. William Wells Brown did not want to leave his family, and he tried so hard to not be put in that position, and it broke his heart when he had to leave his family. So I would be really careful about projecting onto enslaved people our values. We need to understand their values. And then back to this thing, it's not playing into, somebody's, kind of trope. Going back and thinking about what kind of tools did enslaved people have to protect themselves from slavery's worst injustices? One of them is, faking illness on the auction block. How, if you go up there and present yourself as, good, and you do, maybe someone wants to be bought by a particular person, but what do you do if you don't want to be bought by a particular person? What if you don't want to be bought at all? What if you want to stay with your family? So how do you do that? Running away isn't going to solve that problem because you're voluntarily parting yourself from your family. So the only way you can do it is to stop that sale. So how do you stop that sale? So, kind of think through the options that are open to enslaved men and women to stop a sale. And they're not many. And so, yeah, I don't call it a gift. Obadiah called it a gift. But I'm not going to subscribe to Obadiah's values, to Obadiah's explanation, to Obadiah's language. I see it as a bribe. And I see this, and he is bribing them because enslaved people do have these abilities, not everyone, not all the time, but there is a possibility that they could manipulate their sale. Maybe not stop it, but make their opinions known.
What other, we have a couple questions about the sources. We're going to get those and add those into the source document tomorrow because there are quite a few, and I don't want to try to put them in chat because I think it's going to be hard to grab them.
Yeah.
All right. Jamie, I do want to mention we are at the top of the hour. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. If you need to go, we completely understand. Do we have any other questions in the queue to address, Jamie?
I have two that I can combine and then one in the form. So there are two questions that are very similar. One was, were there burial sites for enslaved people on many of the plantations? And are there any marked slave grave sites in the slave states?
Yes, not yes to the last. Yes, enslaved people were buried on plantations. They were buried wherever, the planter allowed them to be buried. But they're not marked. I don't know of any that are marked where we actually know. We stumble across them when we're doing excavation for other reasons. Because it didn't, you have to stop and think about, kind of, the person who's deciding where people are going to be buried is the slaveholder, the master. Does the master have any compelling reason to mark those graves, to remember those people that died? And there's a lot of material history of American slavery that's lost to time because no one considered it for decades, generations. No one really considered it valuable to preserve, or it just faded away and was covered with kudzu and brush, or like clothing, just rotted through overuse. This is one of the problems that the African American History Museum has faced, is trying to find artifacts of enslavement.
And then we had one more question from the form, dealing with rebellions, particularly in other places of the world. Americans were well read and knew about the rebellions happening in the Caribbean. They also understood that some of their enslaved people may have fought in the Haitian Revolution or the Mal Revolution. How did this change the way plantations were specifically run? Also, how did this knowledge shape segregationist policies during the Reconstruction era?
Wow, that's a couple of big questions. Of course, slaveholders and everybody knew about those revolutions. So did enslaved people. I've come across accounts of enslaved people talking how best to get their children to Haiti. They knew that there was a nation governed by free people of color in the Caribbean, and so this was a pretty constant fear on the part of slaveholders, but they also had an economy, and they also had cotton, and they also wanted to get rich. And so, you can kind of think of this as this, central paradox of American slavery in particular, where on the one hand, slaveholders wanted to absolutely control their enslaved laborers and prevent another Haiti, to prevent, another Tacky's rebellion, to prevent another Nat Turner's rebellion. But on the other hand, like poor Stansell Barwick fell out, and that poor is not meant that I sympathize with him. I'm kind of being snarky here. He still needed enslaved people to move back and forth across his plantation to do plantation work. So there, up until the last years of the 1850s, when slaveholders really began to understand that they had one enormous tiger by the tail, they managed to kind of convince themselves that that scale of rebellion would never happen in the North American context. But they were absolutely aware of it. It was the thing that gave them nightmares, but it didn't give them enough nightmares to absolutely clamp down on their slave force, because if they did that, they wouldn't be making money off their staple crops.
Okay, well, I appreciate all of the thoughts and ideas that have been shared. I think the one big takeaway is that there's so much complexity. And I think I know that in an hour we cannot get to all of the complexity and all of the pieces. And I think it's a good takeaway to think back to some of Jason's suggestions earlier of honoring our students, explaining that complexity, but also recognizing where they are and meeting students where they are. And I think this is a constant challenge, and we appreciate all of the ways that you work to do that in your classrooms every day. So with that, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to stop our recording.